Welcome to Engaging the Truth Team Ministry, expressing the love and truth of Jesus Christ.
There are groups, many of them I think, that are seeking to establish a new world order, a world government based on the model of collectivism. They may not all be part of the same organization, but there are many groups which have that as their goal because it furthers their social and political goals, their aims, what they want to see the world look like. You can imagine who these people would be. The ones who control others benefit from a totalitarian system. In other words, politicians like collectivism because collectivism puts ever-increasing power into their hands. Bankers like collectivism because it gives the banks the power to create money with state sanction and state support to create money out of nothing, and that gives control over human beings. Anybody who benefits from controlling others has a natural affinity to this concept of collectivism. They want to be in the driver's seat. They want to be the masters. They want to be the social engineers. They want to be the gatekeepers. And so all of these people work together instinctively, even though they may have separate individual or professional goals. They do work together and support each other toward this ultimate aim of a new world order, is how they like to describe it, which is a totalitarian system based on the model of collectivism.
For I dipped into the future, far as any eye could see, saw a vision of the world and all the wonders that would be, heard the heavens filled with shouting and there rained a ghastly dew of the nation's airy navies grappling in the central blue, till the war drum throbbed no longer and the battle flags were furled in the Parliament of Man, the Federation of the World. And that's what it was about. This idea of the Parliament of Man, the Federation of the World, the establishment of a world government. Now, the ideas that Tennyson put forward in this poem captured the imagination of subsequent generations of people. One of them, of course, was a professor who would be teaching at Oxford University in 1870. His name was Professor John Ruskin. And, of course, this professor was a disciple of Plato, an avowed communist and socialist, and he thought this was a wonderful idea, and he passed this information on to many of his students. Students then were shaped the events that would occur in the early part of this century. Another man was a gentleman named Edward Bellamy. And Edward Bellamy wrote a book that was published in 1888 entitled Looking Backward. Now, this was a fascinating book because it was no sooner published than Bellamy clubs sprang up all over Great Britain and all over the United States, pushing the socialist utopia that he described. And basically, this is a story of an Englishman who fell asleep in 1888, I guess it was, and slept until the year 2000. He took a sedative. It was very effective. He woke up in the year 2000, and he described what the world would be like in that world that we are approaching, and approaching very, very rapidly. And he commented at that time that an American credit card will be just as good in Europe as gold once was. Now, remember, this was written 111 years ago today. At the present time, 111 years ago, Bellamy knew what the future held. Could you imagine people, even at the turn of the century or in the 50s, saying an American credit card will be just as good in Europe as gold once was? He described what had happened is that the corporations kept getting bigger and bigger and bigger, and the corporations began absorbing other corporations until there was just a great trust that ruled everything. The great trust and government, the great corporation and the government controlled everything and provided for every person from the cradle to the grave, and everybody was just so very, very happy. A wonderful utopian view of history. And of course, what Edward Bellamy wrote is, "For I dipped into the future far as any eye could see, saw a vision of the world and all the wonder that would be, till the war drum throbbed no longer and the battle flags were furled in the Parliament of Man and the Federation of the World." It was just 5 years after Bellamy wrote that when Andrew Carnegie published his book, Triumphant Democracy. Now, those of you who are victims of a liberal education, as I was, probably look upon Andrew Carnegie as a robber baron. But Actually, he took the vast fortune that he'd accumulated when he sold U.S. Steel to J.P. Morgan, and he invested that in foundations and endowments which were to bear his name, to convert America from a free into a socialist society. And so it was that Andrew Carnegie, in his book, Triumphant Democracy, wrote, and just look at the part that's underlined, where he says, the Parliament of Man and the Federation of the World have already been hailed by the poet, but these mean a step much further in advance of the proposed reunion of Britain and America. And so this whole idea was to begin to unite the world in pursuit of this dream of world government.
Leveraging the fact that the 20th century opened up numerous avenues for shaping and controlling the thoughts and behaviors of the population, the ruling elite contrived new ways of obscuring useful facts while peddling useless ideas to the American people. Advertising, in addition to fundamental changes in education, produced a population of non-thinkers whose false understanding of basic concepts instilled through public schooling led to generations of people who feel they are magically endowed with the ability to somehow attain knowledge without first observing the landscape of available, credible evidence. One such artifact of credible evidence which demonstrates that our lives are being scripted by the ruling class is a 1966 textbook authored by Georgetown professor Dr. Carroll Quigley, titled Tragedy and Hope, A History of the World in Our Time. In it, Quigley details a secret society, partially funded by central banker Lord Rothschild, enacted by Cecil Rhodes and led by Lord Alfred Milner, and the Round Table Journal of International Affairs, which Quigley terms the Milner Group. The first questions most people ask upon hearing of such a book are, why is it so important? And why do so few know about its existence?
This is a key book. It's almost like the Rosetta Stone to decode everything they're doing. It's over 1,000 pages long with incredible, documentation in the bibliography of how this ruling elite based out of Britain is using a full spectrum dominance model to fund the communists, to fund the fascists, to fund the Democrats, to fund the Republicans, so that there looks like there's a choice, but everything really is moving towards collectivism for the general public, while the elite themselves are exempt from all their own rules.
These are the ideas of people who plunder that care not about laws or boundaries or nations or your rights. They see might makes right. And so when Cecil Rhodes goes in and creates Rhodesia, and you have South Africa and the De Beers whole cartel of diamonds and gold, and then you look at who Cecil Rhodes left his will to, who funded him to go down there and do that, you keep coming back to the historical central bankers that have been manipulating world events as we've been taught them for at least since the beginning of our country. 1776, 1790 is when they start to gain a foothold. They then come over in the 1820s, 1830s, 1840s, pre-Civil War, gain a stronger foothold. And by the end of the Civil War, we're completely switched over to a system that we had fought 60 years before to overthrow.
Once the power structure got all the best and brightest students of the world and put them through Rhodes Scholar type programs, not just in England, but in other nations, they could then control the brain trust and have a fully programmed new generation to take control of the governmental, corporate, and media systems to carry out the program.
Their goal was to dominate all of those major power centers quietly behind the scenes. And by moving the leadership in a certain direction, then they knew that they could control the masses without the masses even knowing that they're being dominated and led by a very small, powerful elite group.
In further pursuit of the science of controlling human resources, the last will and testament of Cecil Rhodes spawned the Pilgrim Society in both America and England, which created a global brain trust.
Its roots go way, way back in history, and they go back to the formation of a secret society, a secret organization that was created by Cecil Rhodes, very powerful and very wealthy individual. And people have heard about him in history, and they know about the Rhodes Scholarship, and they think, well, isn't that nice? That they don't understand at all what that's all about. Cecil Rhodes, when he died, left his great fortune not to his family, not to his heirs, but for the creation of a secret society. And we know about this because there were some people very intimately involved with this organization who wrote about it. One of the best authors on this topic is Professor Carroll Quigley. He wrote several books, and Tragedy and Hope is the best known of his. He described in detail this secret organization created by Cecil Rhodes, and he explains in these books he knows about them because he was invited by the organization into its inner circle. He was never a member of it, but he was invited in as their historian, and he was allowed to see their secret records and papers and study them for several years. And he knew all the important players, and he understood what it was about, and so he wrote these books. And it's an amazing thing because he laid out in great detail what the purpose of the organization was and how they were the major players in all of the big international events since and including World War I. The bottom line is that you take the roots of that organization and you find out that they created in all of the British dependencies what they call roundtable groups. And then around those little roundtable groups, they created front groups. And the purpose of these front groups and roundtable groups was to penetrate into the governments of all of these different countries, to penetrate into the media centers, to penetrate into the educational systems. In other words, to penetrate into the social fabric, the power centers of society, and literally take them over from the inside without anybody being aware that they were controlling influence.
And then, as a student at Georgetown, I heard that call clarified by a professor named Carroll Quigley.
The group that I'm writing about was originally, in my mind, the group established secretly by Lord Milner in 1908 and 1999 called the Roundtable Group, which still publishes a quarterly magazine called The Roundtable in London, which is one of the world's best sources of international relations information since 1910.
Ruskin's message had a sensational impact. His inaugural lecture was copied out in longhand by one undergraduate, Cecil Rhodes, who kept it with him for 30 years. Rhodes, 1853 to 1902, feverishly exploited the diamond and gold fields of South Africa, rose to be Prime Minister of the Cape Colony, 1890 to 1896, contributed money to political parties, controlled parliamentary seats both in England and in South Africa, and sought to win a strip of British territory across Africa, from the Cape of Good Hope to Egypt, and to join these two extremes together with a telegraph line, and ultimately with a Cape to Cairo railway. Rhodes inspired devoted support for his goals from others in South Africa and in England. With financial support from Lord Rothschild and Alfred Beit, he was able to monopolize the diamond mines of South Africa as De Beers Consolidated Mines, and to build up a great gold mining enterprise as Consolidated Goldfields. In the middle 1890s, Rhodes had a personal income of at least £1 million sterling a year, then about $5 million, which was spent so freely for his mysterious purposes that he was usually overdrawn on his account. These purposes centered on his desire to federate the English-speaking peoples and to bring all the habitable portions of the world under their control. For this purpose, Rhodes left part of his great fortune to found the Rhodes Scholarships at Oxford, in order to spread the English ruling class tradition throughout the English-speaking world, as Ruskin had wanted. Among Ruskin's most devoted disciples at Oxford were a group of intimate friends, including Arnold Toynbee, Alfred, later Lord Milner, Arthur Glazebrook, George, later Sir George Parkin, Philip Leighton-Gell, and Henry, later Sir Henry Birchenough. These were so moved by Ruskin that they devoted the rest of their lives to carrying out his ideas. A similar group of Cambridge men, including Reginald Balliol Brett, Lord Esher, Sir John B. Seeley, Albert Lord Grey, and Edmund Garrett, were also aroused by Ruskin's message and devoted their lives to extension of the British Empire and uplift of England's urban masses as two parts of one project, which they called Extension of the English-Speaking Idea. They were remarkably successful in these aims, because England's most sensational journalist, William T. Stead, 1849 to 1912, an ardent social reformer and imperialist, brought them into association with Rhodes. This association was formally established on February 5, 1891, when Rhodes and Steed organized a secret society of which Rhodes had been dreaming for 16 years. In this secret society, Rhodes was to be leader. Steed, Brett, Lord Esher, and Milner were to form an executive committee. Arthur Lord Balfour, Sir Henry Johnston, Lord Rothschild, Albert Lord Grey, and others were listed as potential members of a circle of initiates, while there was to be an outer circle known as the Association of Helpers, later organized by Milner as the Round Table Organization. Brett was invited to join this organization the same day, and Milner a couple of weeks later, on his return from Egypt. Both accepted with enthusiasm. Thus, the central part of the secret society was established by March 1891. It continued to function as a formal group, although the outer circle was apparently not organized until 1909 to 1913. As Governor General and High Commissioner of South Africa in the period 1897 to 1905, Milner recruited a group of young men, chiefly from Oxford and from Toynbee Hall, to assist him in organizing his administration. Through his influence, these men were able to win influential posts in government and international finance, and became the dominant influence in British imperial and foreign affairs up to 1939. Under Milner, in South Africa, they were known as Milner's Kindergarten until 1910. In 1909 to 1913, they organized semi-secret groups known as Round Table Groups in the chief British dependencies and the United States. These still function in 8 countries. They kept in touch with each other by personal correspondence and frequent visits, and through an influential quarterly magazine, The Round Table. Founded in 1910 and largely supported by Sir Abe Bailey's money. In 1919, they founded the Royal Institute of International Affairs, Chatham House, for which the chief financial supporters were Sir Abe Bailey and the Astor family, owners of the Times. Similar institutes of international affairs were established in the chief British dominions and in the United States, where it is known as the Council on Foreign Relations.
They held a series of meetings and resolved to form a new organization in the United States. Its purpose would be to change the American opinion so the nation would accept world government. In 1921, that organization was incorporated in New York City as the Council on Foreign Relations. The Council's original roster reveals that most members were bankers or lawyers affiliated with J.P. Morgan and Company. For example, Morgan's personal attorney, John W. Davis, was the CFR's founding president. Morgan's attorney, Paul Cravath, was founding vice president. Morgan's partner, Russell Leffingwell, was first chairman. Since this looked unsuitable for a foreign affairs association, the Council diversified its roster by adding professors. However, these came from universities receiving large grants from the Morgan interests. The professors, carefully screened, could be relied on to attend Council meetings, then return to the universities and preach the glories of global government. By the late 1920s, the Rockefellers had brought their people into the Council. David Rockefeller was the CFR's chairman for many years and is still honorary chairman in 2014. One way the Council influences government policy is through publications, including many books and especially its periodical Foreign Affairs, a virtual instruction manual for U.S. foreign policymakers. Time magazine has called it the most influential journal in print.
They do have a publication which my husband subscribes to. We've been reading it for a number of years because of the jaw-dropping insight that it provides into what they're thinking. And they don't mince words in there. They will come right out and say that we need to have this form of control, we need to do this form of manipulation, we need to convince people of these certain sets of beliefs. And you read this, and it's written in a very highfalutin, erudite, academic kind of a style. So you have to get past that to really get to the gist and the meat of what's being said.
In the 19th century, August Belmont was a Rothschild financial agent in the United States. With J.P. Morgan, Belmont helped finance Adolph Ochs, who purchased the New York Times, then a tiny newspaper with a circulation of 9,000. International banking behind him, Ochs transformed the Times into the world's most powerful newspaper. The Times' editorial policy has consistently paralleled the establishment's agenda. When members of Congress opposed Paul Warburg's nomination to the Federal Reserve Board, the Times lobbied on his behalf.
The power and influence of this Rhodes-Milner group in British imperial affairs and in foreign policy since 1889, although not widely recognized, can hardly be exaggerated. We might mention as an example that this group dominated the Times from 1890 to 1912 and has controlled it completely since 1912, except for the years 1919 to 1922. Because the Times has been owned by the Astor family since 1922, this Rhodes-Milner group was sometimes spoken of as the Cliveden Set, named after the Astor country house, where they sometimes assembled. Numerous other papers and journals have been under the control or influence of this group since 1889. They have also established and influenced numerous university and other chairs of imperial affairs and international relations. Some of these are the Beit chairs at Oxford, the Montague Burton chair at Oxford, the Rhodes chair at London, the Stevenson chair at Chatham House, the Wilson chair at Aberystwyth, and others, as well as such important sources of influence as Rhodes House at Oxford. From 1884 to about 1915, the members of this group worked valiantly to extend the British Empire and to organize it in a federal system. They were constantly harping on the lessons to be learned from the failure of the American Revolution and the success of the Canadian Federation of 1867, and hoped to federate the various parts of the empire as seemed feasible, then confederate the whole of it with the United Kingdom into a single organization. They also hoped to bring the United States into this organization to whatever degree was possible. Stead was able to get Rhodes to accept, in principle, a solution which might have made Washington the capital of the whole organization, or allow parts of the empire to become states of the American Union.
The Council on Foreign Relations, the bankers had a goal of world government. They know you can't put things over on people too swiftly, but if you do it one bit at a time, in fact, Elihu Root when the Council on Foreign Relations opened the new headquarters in 1929, compared the Council's mission to that of the building of that structure, one brick at a time. That's how foreign policy had to be made. So with world government, they couldn't just impose a all-powerful world government, which of course is the ultimate goal. They had to start out, just as they started out the income tax at 1%, now, well, lo and behold, you're paying double-digit. But they had to start out with a loose confederation, the League of Nations, and that was the 14th point of the famous 14 points that Woodrow Wilson brought to the Paris Peace Conference, which was settling the aftermath of World War I. And of course, he had to work very hard to get us into that war so that America could have a say at the conference table. And of course, that was instituted. And when he went to the conference, it's interesting that Wilson did not bring a single member of the Democratic Party, not a single congressman or senator was invited, but he invited Bernard Baruch as his economic advisor, and Paul Warburg, who he had named, or previously named the vice chairman of the Federal Reserve, he invited him to come as head of the American delegation to the Paris Peace Conference. And of course, he was always under the eye of Edward Mandell House, CFR founder and bankster frontman, who had been controlling him throughout his tenure in the White House. In fact, Edward Mandell House lived right in the White House. So that was the mission. It was to create a world government. But ironically, the Senate, which Wilson had kind of snubbed when he went over to Paris, they did not ratify the treaty. Now, the Constitution of the United States said that to make a treaty, no president could do that unilaterally. He had to have approval from Congress. He didn't get it. The Senate rejected the Versailles Treaty, which created the League of Nations, so we did not join. And so the motivation for the Council on Foreign Relations, when the banksters in Paris got the news that the Senate had rejected the Versailles Treaty, they realized that America was not ready for this step yet. And so they had to create an organization that would change the climate of opinion in America so Americans would become friendly to the idea of world government. And so the council they decided to create the council, and it was incorporated 2 years later in New York City, 1921.
The Council on Foreign Relations, or CFR, headquartered in New York City. Though virtually unknown to the public, the council dominates cabinets of both Republican and Democratic presidents.
When you look at where the wires are connected to the centers of power, you will find again and again that places like the Council on Foreign Relations don't just float ideas. They provide solutions.
You often find members of the Council on Foreign Relations being appointed to various positions in government or industry for that matter, and you see them in the revolving door going back and forth between business and regulatory agencies and stuff like that. The big question is, how substantive is the CFR on global affairs?
Since its founding in 1921, the CFR has produced 21 Secretaries of War and Defense, 19 Treasury Secretaries, 18 Secretaries of State, and 16 CIA Directors. And what is the Council's goal?
The Council on Foreign Relations is a fairly interesting entity to me. And the reason for that is because they have so many members of the CFR who are in media.
I think the CFR exerts tremendous influence over our government, our media, and our centers of education, more so than most people would want to admit.
The Council on Foreign Relations is a very important nexus point, but it's just a vehicle for the larger aims of those who have an agenda. But it's an important vehicle. It's a ring of power that is an engine to encircle the whole world.
You know, once in a while there'll be a spokesperson on major media, and he'll be introduced as such and so, and they'll give credentials, and then they'll mention a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. But that just, it sounds so innocuous, it just passes, it's some council that deals with foreign policy, so people don't remember that.
The number one thing people need to know is that when you have so many members of media who are a part of those organizations or that organization, you have lost the ability to have anyone criticizing globalist agenda or globalist viewpoints because they are members of an organization that pronounces its view is to create, globalism.
They have seized upon foreign policy, economics, and trade to get around the bounds of the Constitution and put their global system on top of America.
When I wrote The Shadows of Power, the main concern I had was that maybe I'd gone too far in attributing our foreign policy to this invisible government. Now it's 26 years later, we've had the arrival of the internet, I've had access to information I never had access to at the time I wrote that book, and my conclusion is that it's not that I went too far, but I didn't go far enough. When the Council on Foreign Relations was formed, and the decision was made at a dinner at the Majestic Hotel in Paris in 1919, after the bankers got the word that the Senate had rejected the Versailles Treaty, so we weren't going to become embroiled in the League of Nations. So there was an organization created. It was in Britain, it was the Royal Institute of International Affairs. In America, it was the Council on Foreign Relations, like sister organizations.
These roundtable groups were put into formation to steer nations and steer their policies rather than control them overtly through direct leadership. They worked through secret maneuvers. The Cecil Rhodes Secret Foundation Trust had been involved not in nation building but in nation manufacturing in the southern part of Africa. And now they wanted the entire world.
Now, how do they control American government policy? The number one way is by serving as a recruiting ground, the recruiting ground for cabinet level positions. You've probably noticed that a lot of people in U.S. cabinets come from the big multinational corporations. How does that happen? Well, the Council on Foreign Relations will invite executives from Citibank or Exxon or Halliburton or Bechtel into the council. They'll attend maybe a study group, attend some dinners, hear some speeches by people like Henry Kissinger, Zbigniew Brzezinski. Now they become experts on policy, and now you see them showing up in the State Department or another major department. When you have one organization controlling the cabinet with a uniform viewpoint, whether the president is Republican or Democrat, naturally you're going to get uniform policies.
Here are some of the prominent members of the CFR, Council on Foreign Relations. George Herbert Walker Bush, Bill Clinton, Sandra Day O'Connor, Dick Cheney, Les Aspin, Colin Powell, Robert Gates, Brent Scowcroft, Jesse Jackson Sr., Mario Cuomo, Dan Rather, Tom Brokaw, David Brinkley, John Chancellor, Marvin Kalb, Diane Sawyer, Barbara Walters, Cyrus Vance, Paul Volcker, Henry Kissinger, George Shultz, Bruce Babbitt, Howard Baker, Samuel Berger, Elaine Chao, Dianne Feinstein, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, Chuck Hagel, Gary Hart, John McCain, George Mitchell, Bill Moyers, Jay Rockefeller, Donna Shalala, Strobe Talbot, Fred Thompson, Robert Zoellick, Richard Nixon, Hubert Humphrey, George McGovern, Gerald Ford, Jimmy Carter, John Anderson, Walter Mondale, Michael Dukakis, Al Gore, John Kerry, on and on. I mean, you notice first of all that you're talking Republicans and Democrats, conservatives and liberals. You're talking people in every area of government and news media. You're talking education establishment. You're talking basically the key establishment institutions of the country are all infiltrated with Council on Foreign Relations members. Why is this institution so powerful that no matter whether it's a Republican or a Democrat in the White House, they are going to fill their administration with members of the CFR?
Admiral Chester Ward, former Judge Advocate General of the U.S. Navy, was a CFR member for 16 years. Before resigning in disgust, he stated the Council's objective.
Submergence of U.S. sovereignty into an all-powerful one-world government. This lust to surrender the sovereignty and independence of the United States is pervasive throughout most of the membership.
This is a man who was also invited to become part of the CFR and was a member for a few years until he recognized what the CFR was all about. After finding that out, he withdrew his membership from the CFR, and then he did his best to inform the American people as to what the CFR was all about.
The Council's journal, Foreign Affairs, has pushed for world government for over 90 years. In its first year of publication, 1922, it declared, "Obviously, there is going to be no peace or prosperity for mankind so long as it remains divided into 50 or 60 independent states. The real problem today is that of world government."
When you put all of that together, you recognize that the CFR, the Trilateral Commission, is nothing more but an elaborate attempt to, as they say themselves, make an end run around national sovereignty, diminish the independence and autonomy of the United States, and merge it into this global governing institution that they, of course, foresee themselves running.
America's founding fathers recognized the dangers of concentrating power. They therefore split government power into three branches. In the founding fathers' original vision, the power of the entire federal government would be held in check by the states. Decentralization of power has spared Americans the oppression of totalitarian dictatorships that other nations have known. James Madison, known as the father of the U.S. Constitution, said,
"The accumulation of all power, legislative, executive, and judiciary, in the same hands may justly be pronounced the very definition of tyranny."
If we follow the money to see who is behind the Council on Foreign Relations, it becomes clear that the U.S. foreign policy establishment is intimately linked to Wall Street and the banking establishment.
The League of Nations was the first attempt at the New World Order, the first attempt at a global government based on the model of collectivism. And it was the brainchild of the elitists, the ancestors of the very people who are still working on this project. They're collectivists, the very wealthy people. They're the ones in this country who dominated the powerful tax-exempt foundations, like the Carnegie Endowment Fund for International Peace, the Rockefeller Funds, the Ford Foundation, and groups like that. These people were on record, even way back then, that they had to have a new world government, and they dreamed of that being embodied in the League of Nations. And they were solidly behind it. And that was one of the reasons those people encouraged the United States into World War I, was because of the crisis of World War I, and that would also condition Americans to thinking of making big changes in their system, because we certainly don't want another war like that, do we? There's that fear angle again. And they thought, well, by being in World War I, then we would be a major participant at the table to carve up the world and create a new world government. and that was to be the League of Nations. Well, what happened to it is that the American people didn't really go for it. In all of the British dependencies, these organizations, the front groups, were called the Royal Institute for International Affairs. In the United States, they chose a different name. They chose the Council on Foreign Relations, but it held exactly the same relationship to this inner society of Cecil Rhodes.
Among the charter members were W. Averill Harriman of Union Banking, then President of the United States Woodrow Wilson's main advisor, Colonel Edward Mendell House, John D. Rockefeller, the founder of Standard Oil, banking mogul J.P. Morgan, and prominent bankster Paul Warburg.
Well, the Council on Foreign Relations exists today. It's probably the most powerful single organization in America. Many observers, including myself, believe that it is the hidden government of the United States. These people are not elected to office, and most Americans don't even know who they are. But they are holding all of the important positions in society. There are only about 4,000 of them in the United States, but I don't care what organization you want to look at, whether it's government or whether it's universities or the large media centers or whatever it is. You look at the people at the tops of those organizations, the owners, the managers, the CEOs, the board of directors, and I'm going to say probably 80 to 90% of the great power centers of America are dominated by just those 4,000 people who are members of the Council on Foreign Relations.
That's how Lord Halifax got it. His name was Charles Wood in 1903 when he graduated from Oxford. He took a competitive examination and got it, but he's kept it. Now, I discovered he kept it because he went immediately to South Africa and met the kindergarten, which was the group of people that were running South Africa for Lord Milner, you see. They were called kindergarten because they were all young kids, you see. Now, these are the ones who remained forever after, fellows of all sorts, or in Lionel Curtis's case, he's the man who said, we've got to change the name from British Empire to Commonwealth of Nations. And the reason is they had been students of Alfred Zimmermann, who wrote a book in 1909 called The Greek Commonwealth, describing ancient Greece, you see, and who was the man who made Arnold Toynbee a great classical scholar, do you see, and brought him into international affairs. Now, I knew none of this. All I knew is that here was a fellow, Lionel Curtis, who was such a poor student, it took him 15 years to get his degree, and then he got it about the lowest pass degree or something that you could ever get. And nobody knew it. Nobody had ever heard of him.
Right. But he was
furthermore,
in a company.
I later discovered, furthermore, he was Lord Halifax's roommate at All Souls for years. And then I discovered this fella is behind everything that's going on. Lionel Curtis, do you see? Now, I don't think we should talk too much about this.
Well, no, I
do see. All right. All right. But having discovered that, I met Alfred Zimmermann. He came here to give a speech. And I said, isn't it funny that All Souls, he said, that's the Round Table Group. I had never heard of them. That shows how little I knew. And they've been around since 1909 and published this magazine since 1910, and this is 1947. And I said, what does the Round Table Group? He named them, who they were. And he says, I was a member of them for 10 years, from 1913, and they brought me in and invited me because I was in the Workers' Educational Alliance. This was extension programs, night courses, summer courses for workers, Workers' Educational Alliance. And he said, that's why they brought me into it, and I was for 10 years, and he says, I resigned in 1923 because they were determined to build up Germany against France. He says, I wouldn't stand for it, so I resigned. Now, when I met Lord Brand later and asked him about this, he had never seen the letter of resignation. Now, and so I better stop talking because, you see, this gets into all kinds of things. Now, this is, I knew the Round Table Group was very influential. I knew that they were the real founders of the Royal Institute of International Affairs, and I knew they were all the stuff that's in print, that they were the real founders of the Institute of Pacific Relations. I knew that they were the godfathers of the Council on Foreign Relations here. I knew that, for example, you know the big study of history, many volumes of Arnold Toynbee? All right. I knew the manuscripts of that were stored in the Council on Foreign Relations during the war so they wouldn't be destroyed by German bombing, do you see? And so forth. And so forth. So I began to put these things together and discovered that this group was working for the following things. They were a secret group. They were working to federate the English-speaking world, the English-speaking world. They were closely linked to international bankers. They were working to establish a world, what I call a three-power world. And that three-power world was the Atlantic bloc of England and the Commonwealth and the United States, Germany, Hitler's Germany, Soviet Russia, the three-power world.
The British foreign policy for Germany in the post-war period reflected the exact aims of Welles's policy. The Versailles Treaty of 1919, imposing nearly all of the post-war reparations on Germany, meant an undoing of all of Bismarck's previous successes and a dissolution of Germany as a sovereign country. At gunpoint, the most productive agricultural lands and natural resources were seized. Ships, locomotives, and half of the nation's gold reserves were taken away. Social programs were eliminated, industries privatized, and vicious waves of speculation unleashed on the Deutschmark. The Reichsbank desperately printed mountains of currency in the vain hope of covering the unpayable debt, leading to the hyperinflation crisis of 1923. The British had finally reconquered Germany. In Southwest Asia, the same policy was pursued. Secret negotiations of the British Arab Bureau and French Foreign Ministry had created the Sykes-Picot Accord, which mandated British control of the Palestine, Transjordan, and Iraq region, and French control of Lebanon and Syria. Still to this day, the manipulation of religious and ethnic tensions to create wars in this region echoes back to this repositioning of empire. In the United States, the same banks and cartels dismantling the German nation positioned themselves for similar actions against the already weakened American system. J.P. Morgan's bank, located at 23 Wall Street, had been established as the American arm of a British bank and steered as an insurrection into American finance since the 1860s. By the 1920s, the House of Morgan operated more akin to a cartel than a bank, with no public function and a board which reached into thousands of American companies, industries, and utilities. The hand of Morgan was known to be monarchical in the land of American finance, only subsumed in power by the British Empire he was acting for. It was this vast financial network which would take over the political parties, install a series of London and Wall Street-controlled presidents like Calvin Coolidge, and advise the dismantling of the American system.
Although education has proven to be highly effective in controlling human behavior, more intensive research would need to be conducted away from the prying eyes of the public.
The Tavistock Institute was set up by the British Empire to really study mind control and to scientifically drill down into human behavior and put in textbook form systems of basic control so that could be duplicated out to government and corporate entities. And Tavistock has been involved at every level of social engineering.
The Tavistock Clinic was founded in 1920 and operated as part of the Psychological Warfare Division of the British military. It was initially a voluntary outpatient clinic for treatment and research and was made up of general physicians, neurologists, and psychiatrists to facilitate the treatment of neurosis and shell-shocked British soldiers returning home from World War I.
Going through their own publications on Amazon, you can find that some of their books cost like $18,000, $20,000. And what that tells me is they don't want the average person to be anywhere near getting their hands on this book, because what it gives you inside those books is the teacher's edition, to use an abstraction, as opposed to the students sitting around the class not knowing what the answers to the questions are. There's a group of people who are being given the answers to all the questions about how we act, react, and how we've been understimulated with curiosity in order to make us more subordinative.
You could say much of our world today is the world of the Tavistock Institute and Edward Bernays.
Having been instrumental in the Tavistock Clinic and director of the Tavistock Institute of Human Relations, it was former officer and consulting psychiatrist to the British Army, John Rawlings Rees, who created the concept of the psychological shock troops, or culture warriors, a federation of psychiatrists, which he intended to disperse across the globe to make it, quote, possible for people of every social group to have treatment when they need it, even when they do not wish it, without it being necessary to invoke law. Edward Bernays, the nephew of Sigmund Freud, is well known as the father of modern propaganda and public relations, and for his application of psychological techniques to the field of advertising.
People have a herd instinct. They tend to move in groups. They make conclusions based on emotion and feelings and desires.
Edward Bernays, the nephew of Sigmund Freud, the archetypal psychologist, psychiatrist, openly bragged that there was a ruling elite that had taken control of society and that could basically program people like machines to walk off the edge of a cliff if ordered to do so. He was the guy that said, don't call yourself the Department of War, call yourself the Department of Defense. And he wrote book after book, like the book Propaganda, 1922, bragging about how we were all dumb animals and how the public mind was in his hand. They couldn't sell pork bellies. They were seen as junk meat, only used as flavoring in soups. They came out and said, no breakfast is complete without eggs and bacon, and showed a woman, in the newsreel sitting there cooking it. And he said, look, I can make these people do anything I want. And so he is really the archetypal father of brainwashing and propaganda right as the age of television began. And they took his sciences and just wrecked this country.
Some of his most famous clients included Procter & Gamble, General Motors, General Electric, the United Fruit Company, Westinghouse Electric, Time Magazine, NBC, and CBS.
He looked at what Uncle Freud had plumbed out, how the unconscious worked, and devised in his own mind the idea that you could cause people to do what you wanted them to do because they chose to do it. Indeed, in his work, Propaganda, he makes it clear that it is the duty of the intellectual elite to orchestrate the beliefs and behaviors of the public in order to have a cohesive society.
They got together and said, well, people are too darn dumb. We have to program them mentally to do what they're supposed to do. Political science is largely based today on Bernays' work.
In 1917, Bernays served on the Committee for Public Information, otherwise known as the Creel Committee, which set out to change public opinion in favor of the United States' involvement in World War I. At the request of Woodrow Wilson, Bernays personally attended the Paris Peace Conference of 1919, the same year that he would found the first public relations firm in the United States.
Advancing some of this work, of course, he was commissioned by Woodrow Wilson and to assist in selling the idea of World War I, that it was about spreading democracy throughout Europe. He is, for all intent and purposes, the father of what we call today neuromarketing.
It has been widely reported that Joseph Goebbels had employed Bernays' Crystallizing Public Opinion, the first book written on the emerging field of public relations, while formulating his own propaganda campaigns for Nazi Germany. Moving beyond Bernays, other luminaries in the manufacturing of public consent included Walter Lippmann and Ivy Lee, both of whom complemented these tactics by expanding the breadth and depth of mass media entrainment of individual minds.
And then I read 1928, a book by Walter Lippmann, talking about public relation and public opinion, and basically saying the same thing, that the public is not inherently irrational, but they can use PR and propaganda and media to play upon people's existing irrationality instead of introducing them to the concepts and definitions of that which exists. So instead of creating world peace by putting everyone on the same page, by giving us a method to discern fact from fiction. They use that gap in our perception to play tricks on us. So that's all I've ever seen during human history, is human beings playing tricks on other human beings.
As for Ivy Lee, he was not only popular with some of America's most prestigious corporations and foundations, he also found time in his busy schedule to personally counsel John D. Rockefeller, to represent Standard Oil, and was one of the earliest members of the Council on Foreign Relations.
The Council on Foreign Relations is well known among researchers of parapolitics as one of the organizations of interest directing Washington's foreign policy. Once derided as conspiracy theory, the influence of the group is now a truism that is openly joked about in Washington's foreign policy circles.
It's good to be back at the Council on Foreign Relations. As Pete mentioned, I've been a member for a long time and was actually a director for some period of time. I never mentioned that when I was campaigning for re-election back home in Wyoming.
Thank you very much, Richard, and I am delighted to be here in these new headquarters. I have been often to, I guess, the mothership in New York City, but it's good to have an outpost of the Council right here down the street from the State Department. We get a lot of advice from the Council, so this will mean I won't have as far to go to be told what we should be doing and how we should think about the future.
What many do not know, however, is that the CFR is in fact a branch of a slightly older, slightly less known organization, the Royal Institute of International Affairs. Born from the ashes of war-ravaged Europe following the Great War, the idea for the RIIA was forged at an informal session during the 1919 Paris Peace Conference. The institute was formalized the next year, first as the British Institute of International Affairs, and then, after receiving its royal charter, as the Royal Institute of International Affairs. The group became synonymous with Chatham House, its headquarters in St. James's Square in London, and is widely recognized among foreign policy experts as the most influential think tank in the world.
In a world of growing interdependence, the need for rigorous and independent analysis has never been greater. This is true first in the area of international economics, where the global financial crisis and the rise of the G20 are completely changing the international context. Second, we have competition for resources, for oil, for gas, but also for food and water, and how this is interacting with changing climates. Then third, there's the changing balance between the established powers and the rising powers, and what this means for security. Chatham House works across these three areas: in international economics, in energy, environment, and resource governance, and in regional and security studies. We publish reports, we publish papers, we hold discussions and conferences, and we discuss our ideas with policymakers from around the world.
In the years since its inception, the RIIA has opened branches in countries across the British Commonwealth and around the world, including the Council on Foreign Relations, born largely from the same 1919 Paris meeting that birthed the Institute itself, the Australian Institute of International Affairs, the South African Institute of International Affairs, the Pakistan Institute of International Affairs, the Canadian International Council, and similar organizations. Officially, the Royal Institute of International Affairs, like its various branch organizations, is a non-profit, non-governmental think tank that promotes analysis of international issues and world affairs in four main research areas: energy, environment and resources, international economics, international security, and area studies and international law. Also like its branch organizations, the majority of the group's publications and proceedings are open to the public and freely available via their website or their journal, International Affairs. Funded by partners, patrons, and corporate members that read like a who's who of the Fortune 500, including Chevron, AIG, Bloomberg, Toshiba, Morgan Stanley, Goldman Sachs, Lockheed Martin, Royal Dutch Shell, the European Commission, and dozens of other corporations, institutions, and foreign governments, Chatham House consistently attracts some of the best-known speakers on a wide range of topics, releasing reports that set the global policy agenda, not only for Britain, but for much of the rest of the developed world as well.
We have further challenging issues to address between now and 2015, including how to take account of countries' common but differentiated responsibilities for tackling climate change, by moving towards a spectrum of commitments that reflects the economic realities of the 21st century. The current binary divide between developing and developed countries was defined in 1990, and I believe it's time to move on from it.
The role of policymakers is actually to try to manage this transition and to understand that we are living through a very different time. And I stress, and this time is really different from other periods in recent history where we discuss the reform of the monetary system. So managing a transition means more policy cooperation.
Militaries around the world aspire to our standards and the ability of our forces to work together. Importantly, we can integrate other nations' contributions into complex multinational operations like no other organization.
It was from that the Council on Foreign Relations sprang in this country. There were similar organizations in other British dependencies, and they all had as their goal the creation of a unified world government based on the model of collectivism. So there was this milieu of political and intellectual movement starting over 100 years ago. But it certainly has gained momentum through World War I, really got up to speed, and then finally in World War II, all of the major players on the world scene were talking about world government. They tried to do the League of Nations, that failed. Finally, they created the United Nations, that stuck. And so now they're just trying to pump up the United Nations into the framework of the global government that they have always envisioned. And this has been a thing that goes beyond one generation. It's transgenerational. In other words, it's not just one person's vision. The people that started it are long gone, but those who inherited it continue this dream. To them, I'm sure they look at it as a wonderful thing. They see it as an end of nationhood, as it has been historically defined. They see that as advantageous, they say, because it'll put an end to war and so forth. And they can sell the idea as a great step toward brotherhood and a unified globe and so forth. They use all of these things to make it sound good. But when you start examining the actual policies that they're instituting, it's not so hot. It's based on the principle of collectivism, as I've said several times, and that means it's all-powerful government. It's a tyrannical government. It's the same kind of a system that Adolf Hitler had in mind, and we fought a war to destroy him and his system. The same kind of a system that Joseph Stalin had in mind, and we fought a Cold War and did a lot of other things to make sure that that didn't happen. The same kind of a system that Mao Zedong had in mind, and Benito Mussolini. All of the great collectivists of history have had this unified global government based on the model of collectivism as their goal, and we fought against it until recently. Now we are actually the greatest advocates of it ourselves. We don't call it tyranny. We don't call it fascism or Nazism or communism. We have a better name for it. The name they have chosen is the New World Order. That's their favorite phrase for it. But when you examine its nature and its essence, it is a collectivist system, powerful government, little people at the bottom taking orders. So this is the concept. It's been under evolution for over 100 years. It looks like it's coming within sight now. We've seen the nations of Europe amalgamate into the European Union. The sovereignty of all of the European nations has been pretty well lost now to the European Union, and they've always said that was a stepping stone toward the creation of a true world government, is to unite the smaller governments of the world first into regional groupings, such as the European Union. They have one in mind for Asia and Africa, and now they're talking about doing the same on the North American continent, called the North American Union, and it'll be a merger of the United States, Mexico, and Canada. A process that they deny that is underway, but it is definitely underway, and it's been underway for over a decade. And if you examine some of the laws and administrative rulings that are coming out of the federal government at all levels, they often use the word harmonization, meaning they're going to harmonize or attempting to harmonizing our laws with the laws of Canada and Mexico. So this process is well underway. We have seen the euro, a replacement of national currencies in Europe, a single regional currency. Now they're talking about the same thing here in the United States. To get rid of the US dollar, get rid of the Mexican peso and the Canadian dollar, and create a new currency for the three. They'll probably call it the Amero. That's the name they seem to be favoring at the moment. Step by step, this structure of world government based on the model of collectivism is being erected. Every day you can look in your newspaper and see evidence of another brick that's been put in place, another timber has been put in place. That's going on and on. So is this a good process or a bad process? Is it an inevitable process? Well, first of all, I don't think it's inevitable because it has to be done by people, and people have to want to do it or not want to do it. It's well advanced because the people that are in charge, the people we elect, the people who are running our own government, the people who are running the governments of these other nations, at the top, these people are all for it. So that's why it's happening. At the voter level, I don't think most people even know that it's happening. And if they did know, they'd probably say, I don't think this is a good idea. So the trick has always been how to make this happen without getting the American people or the people in Britain or France or Germany or Mexico or Canada too much alarmed about it before it's too late. That has always been the strategy that they have followed. So that means they have to deny that it's happening. It means they have to do it behind closed doors. That means they don't bring it up for a vote in Congress. They do it administratively rather than legislatively. And all of those strategies and tactics are being used. Is it a good thing or a bad thing? In my view, it's a very bad thing because I think collectivism is the graveyard of civilization. It's certainly the graveyard of freedom. If you just think about it, no collectivist system in the world has ever been the kind of a place where freedom was prosperous. People always wound up in the gulag or some kind of a concentration camp if they disagreed with their leaders. All of these factors, I think, need to be understood in order for us to come up with an intelligent plan of what to do about it. Because all of this is, academic unless we come up with a plan of what to do about it. And the first step in knowing what to do about it is knowing what not to do about it. And by that I mean what not to do about it is to fall for this left-right paradigm where both the right wing and the left wing are both pursuing this objective but fighting each other. And if we get caught up in that trap, we'll spend all of our time fighting the leftists or fighting the rightists, and it doesn't make any difference because no matter which side you're on in that battle, you still are promoting this globalist government strategy. So the first thing to know is don't get trapped in this left-right paradigm.
Thank you for listening or watching. Don't forget to share this content. We know that your first priority is to your local church, but if you feel led to support our gospel effort financially, please check the description for details. God bless you.